Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for being here. It's lovely to see you. Sorry, we had to cancel our previous SCRIBO seminar, but we had a force majeure reason for that. But it will be postponed and possibly very soon. Currently, Overman is going to give her talk on ancient numbers, the evolution of ancient numbers. But please let me introduce a friend and very, as I said, assiduous attendee of our SCRIBO seminars, Professor Aaron J. Koller. He is Associate Professor of Near Eastern and Jewish Studies at Yeshiva University in the US, where he studies the ancient world of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East, especially through the lens of material culture, language, and intellectual history. He's clearly a very interdisciplinary scholar. And Aaron is interested in life as it was lived in ancient times and finds that studying the languages of ancient times can provide us with windows into all sorts of issues. He's interested especially in the Near Eastern cultures from the Late Bronze Age through to rabbinic literature, and he's contributed a lot to the reading of the Bible. He is a very prolific author, 8 books between monographs and edited volumes. And let me just say that the pandemic has not slowed Aaron down, because 2 books came out in 2020, penned by him. One is Unbinding Isaac, the significance of the Akedah for the modern Jewish thought. And the other one is Semitic Biblical and Jewish Studies in honor of Richard Steiner, which came out with Yeshiva University Press last year. And another one, let me just quote, Esther in Ancient Jewish Thought, was published by Cambridge University Press 7 years ago now, and Aaron is the author of so many, very many articles. Today, he will pick up a topic that we have never addressed in our SCRIBO series, the origins of the alphabet. So I'm very excited to hear more. And here is Aaron with, in the beginning, there was no word, the invention of words in alphabetic writing. Thank you so much, Aaron, for being here. Let me just remind you that we're going to have another SCRIBO seminar in 7 days' time on the 14th of April with Torsten Meissner from the University of Cambridge, who's going to be talking about the Cretan hieroglyphic with new approaches to the research of this undeciphered script. So please do join us on the 14th of April, same time, same place. We'll send you the link soon. Thank you so much. Aaron, over to you.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. Yes, okay. I should clarify that the pandemic has absolutely slowed everything down, and anything that came out in the last year is because it was in press already before that.
Okay.
So this is, yeah, it's actually good to feel like here I'm going to give a paper. This is something that I haven't presented. It's been a work in progress for a couple of years, but certainly progress has been slow in the last year and a half. So I'm grateful for the opportunity. And you mentioned that I attend these as often as I can. I learn so much from the broad range of topics that have been mentioned here, and I find them constantly enriching my own thinking and work. From all different perspectives. So I'm grateful to you and the whole team for organizing them, and certainly for the opportunity to participate as a presenter here.
Thank you, Aaron. You're too kind. It's lovely to have you.
All right. Okay, so this is part of a larger project to try to rewrite the early history of the alphabet. I'm actually somewhat shocked to hear that this has not been a topic discussed in the SCRIBO seminars until this point. This project of mine is part of an even larger project, a cultural history of the alphabet, which hopefully I'll have a chance to talk about at some point. But it's as I said, things are taking a long time, and this will take a couple more years to really get going. But here I'm going to be focusing on the question of the first few centuries of the alphabet, and I'm going to try to use a narrow question to try to pry open some of the larger topics relevant to the invention and early history of the alphabet. So there are a few really major questions about the alphabet, the invention and the early history of the alphabet that remain unanswered. Here are 2 big ones that have been debated without a lot of progress in past years. Why didn't the early alphabet change the world over the first centuries of its existence? By conventional wisdom, and I'm not going to talk about it directly, but I'll assume it in the coming discussion, the alphabet is invented by about 1900 BCE. And yet we don't really see any extended texts in alphabetic writing for at least 600-700 years. Another question, were the inventors of the alphabet already literate in another writing system? In particular, did they know how to read Egyptian hieroglyphs? This was debated 10-15 years ago in a number of papers, but to be honest, there's no, as of yet, conclusive answer to that question. Regarding the first one, which is more central to what we'll be talking about this afternoon, this morning, depending on where you are, scholars started to observe a number of decades ago that even though the alphabet seemed like it was a big deal, nothing really happened. So Cross wrote in 1989 that with the creation of the alphabet came the first opportunity for the democratization of culture. With the invention of alphabetic writing, literacy spread like wildfire, and a new epoch of cultural history may be said to begin with the emergence of the linear alphabet. But even though he said that literacy spread like wildfire, he knew, and other people pointed out, that was not empirically true. The alphabet existed for hundreds of years before literacy spread. We don't have to go like wildfire, but literacy spread in any substantive way at all. Benjamin Zass, writing around the same time, wrote, "It's the invention of the alphabet that brought literacy potentially within the reach of every man," and man here is obviously in the sense that would have been used in the 1980s of human being, even if this potential was not realized until much later. And that's a key observation. So as I said, I'm going to start with a much smaller question. And I think that starting with a smaller question will help make progress on large questions. I should be honest, and I'll say this transparently, and for those who are interested in the methodologies of scholarship here, I started this by trying to tackle the big questions and realized that the big questions have to be built on a lot of little building blocks. And those building blocks in and of themselves are not the most fascinating questions, but one by one, they can produce a building, an edifice, that's much more solid than a building built on theories and abstractions without a lot of data. So we're going to be dealing with something here that actually does have data, and that allows for some more conclusive conclusions at the end. All right. There's some more quotes about the delay in the expansion of the alphabet from Lemaire in 2008 and Goldwasser in 2016. Just noting again this half millennium or so between the invention of the alphabet and its widespread use. But let's turn to the specific question. The specific question is the question of the word. The concept of a word is deeply paradoxical. On the one hand, it's the most basic unit of language. We think we hear it, we see it all the time. We talk about children learning words. You find, for example, that by age 6, at least English-speaking children learn about 14,000 words. We talk about adults using words. In the US, at least, I often assign papers by word count. So I don't want to have to measure margins and tell the students whether they should double space. So say a final paper should be 5,000 words. So words are all over the place. We have spelling tests in 2nd grade that contain lists of words. But on the theoretical level, the concept of the word is a very elusive one. And the harder we look at it, the more elusive it becomes. And to a large degree, and this is something that we'll talk more about, it is writing itself that creates the illusion that word is a stable concept. And after all, if I'm forced by convention to leave a space before and after each word, then presumably I have to have a well-defined rule for what a word is. Now, the spectrograph in front of you is natural speech. And of course, it's, you find this in any intro to linguistics book or a psychology book, that there is no audible break between words. The breaks here do not actually divide words. You can follow the transcription on the bottom, and see that the in common speech, if you're transcribing my speech right now without knowledge of the language, there would be no audible way of deciding when a word had just begun and when had ended. I do not pause in between each word that I speak. And if I did so, it would sound like very, very strange speech. So natural speech is not obviously broken up into audible words. And linguists have been talking about this for a long time. Edward Sapir thought that back in 1921, any competent speaker would intuitively know what a word was, but he still couldn't define it. And you see the quote in front of you. It is high time that we decided just what is meant by a word. In truth, he writes, it is impossible to define the word from a functional standpoint at all. For the word may be anything from the expression of a single concept, concrete or abstract or purely relational, as in of or by or and, to the expression of a complete thought, as in Latin dico or dicho, I say, or with greater elaborateness of form, in a nutka verb denoting, I have been accustomed to eat 20 round objects, for example, apples, while engaged in doing so and so. So there is allegedly a nutka word that means that. In the middle of the 20th century, linguists offered various definitions of a word. So for example, Yuri Kramsky offered this definition: the smallest independent unit of language referring to a certain extralinguistic reality or to a relation of such realities and characterized by certain formal features, acoustic, morphemic, either actually as an independent component of the context or potentially as a unit of the lexical plan. So this is what I meant, that the harder we look, the harder the concept becomes. When we really try to define it, it turns out that a definition might be incredibly complicated. More recently, researchers have emerged with two complementary conclusions. On the one hand, and this is taken especially from Dixon and Eichenwald in a publication from about 20 years ago, and then from a publication from about 6 weeks ago, even though it's dated 2020. One is that the category of word contains many clear examples and some fuzzy examples around the margins. Of course, this shouldn't surprise us, given what we know about human categories more generally. This is true about the vast majority of categories that are not scientific categories. And two, that we have to distinguish between phonological words and grammatical words. And these two conclusions taken together have allowed researchers to make significant progress in the study of words and the idea of words in various languages. So for philologists, the important question is not whether linguists can agree on a useful definition of a word, but how regular speakers, literate, and I would love to stress illiterate, think of words. In other words, the relevant question is not so much the scientific meaning of the word word, but the folk meaning of the word word. And recent decades have again generated a large literature on how people think about words. One key question has been when children understand that a word can exist independently of its referent. But another, more relevant to questions of early writing, is how adults conceptualize the borders around words. Regular speakers have a hard time, in English, deciding if birthday and shouldn't are one word or two words. Phonologically and orthographically, birthday and shouldn't are single words, but speakers know that they derive from two words and that speakers know those two words. And the second one, shouldn't, is actually two words syntactically as well. Speakers also notice that there seems to be no reason for birthday to be a single word, but wedding day to be two words, especially since wedding day also has the single stress on that first word, first component, that suggests that it's a compound noun. So speakers are often simply uncertain about the status of such things, is that one word or two words. And literacy is actually a complicating factor here, because people who read have to grapple with the fact that a word don't or shouldn't appears as one word on the page in front of them, but they know to be two words derivationally and syntactically. So generally, we have different intuitions about what you might call wordhood, which sometimes overlap and sometimes conflict. So we have categories like phonological word, lexical item, syntactic word, grammatical word, and these do not always overlap. And again, coming back to the question of writing systems, all of these categories on occasion conflict with the orthographic word. Different languages do it differently. So German is quite famous for compounding words, where English will retain separate words. And not all languages have clear tendencies, but certainly one can't expect that what one finds about one language will apply across the board to other languages. Some of this is language and cultural specific. Now, an underutilized data set relevant to these questions is ancient texts, because we can ask the question, when and how did scribes indicate that a word began and ended? If we go back early enough in scribal traditions, the texts reflect a transition period from folk intuitions to orthographic regulations. In other words, there is a time period for every writing system where there are no rules yet for what scribes ought to do as to how to mark the end of words. And so they have to use their own intuitions, their own pre-literate intuitions, to decide when to mark the end of words. So the theoretical considerations about words can help us understand what we find in those texts, and in turn, textual traditions can better inform the theory. So I'm going to focus here on Northwest Semitic texts written in the very early alphabetic scripts. Short texts of this sort appear already in the early 2nd millennium BCE. These are the, I think, well-known Wadi al-Hol inscriptions. Two very short graffiti from a deep wadi near Thebes in Upper Egypt. It's thought, for pretty good reason, that each of these consists of about 3 words, what we would call words. But of course, you see immediately that there is no division within each of these inscriptions between words. There's no space, there's no dot. And so, of course, the exact number cannot be known within each of these. It's also very relevant that neither of these has been fully or conclusively deciphered. There's a plausible decipherment for one, but for the other one, not even that. And hopefully in a bit, I'll come back to try to offer an explanation, not for what they mean, but for why it's not clear what they mean. The next major corpus of texts, which is only a major corpus by the standards of early alphabetic writing, I think other scholars might laugh at calling this a major corpus, is the few dozen texts found at Sirabit al-Khadim, including this very well-known Sphinx in the British Museum. These texts were found beginning in 1905 by Petrie, and then over a few excavations over the coming decades found a few more, even down to the late 1970s, when Sinai was under Israeli control, and an Israeli excavation discovered a couple more texts in Sirabit al-Khadim. The longest of these texts stretches over 5 lines of writing, and here too, if you look here, for example, there is no indication of where a word ends. They're simply signs written in order. The most famous phrase at Sirabit, which is this phrase, it's actually on the right wing of the Sphinx. I don't mean anatomically wing, but the right side of the Sphinx, under the Egyptian hieroglyphic inscription, which says "beloved of Hathor." We have this alphabetic inscription, which is very important for the history of the decipherment of the alphabet. But for our purposes right now, I'll leave that story aside and just focus on what it actually says. Reading from left to right, it has a mim, alif, mem, aleph, hey, or ha, ba, bet, and then an ayin, a lamed, and a taf, which we can't quite see in this picture. It's sort of around the corner, which means something like, well, pronounced something like mi'uhab ba'alat, beloved of the lady. But what's really interesting here is that this is how, oh, sorry. This is how you would write mi'uhab ba'alat. You notice on the slide that there are two words here, mi'uhab ba'alat. Mi'uhab, beloved of, ends with a B, and ba'alat begins with a B, but the inscription actually has only one B. In other words, the scribe, and I certainly don't mean a professional scribe here, but the person who wrote this actually wrote the same sign to serve as double duty, to be both the last letter in the first word and the first letter in the second word. So mi'uhab ba'alat, written with only one B at that juncture between what we would call two words. And there are other examples of this, of similar phenomena at Saravet. In this inscription, I think also quite a well-known image, there's the phrase matal ba'alat, which means something like a gift to Ba'alat, to the lady, to the goddess. But the end of the word matan, which means gift, has been swallowed up in the following letters. That's obviously a very imprecise way of saying it. The phonologically more precise way of saying it would be that the N was assimilated to the following L. And so we expect gemination in the L, but it doesn't really matter for our purposes. The point is that the scribe, not only is there no marking to separate one word from the next, but that even a complete word is not always written. If the writer heard one word running into the next word, they often wrote it as they heard it. So they wrote one letter to serve as at that juncture between the two words, or in a case like this, didn't even write the end of one word because it was swallowed up in the beginning of the next word. So the writing here is really sort of conceptually similar to what we find on a spectrograph of spoken speech. Unlike professional writing, where we correct for what we hear. In other words, even though in my spoken language, I don't separate between words, in my written language, of course, I do. I know to put a space in between every word. These writers don't do that. What they hear is what they write. So why did the writers of these early texts not mark the division between words? So in a very influential, very short, influential article, Joseph Navet argued that the relevant factor was not conceptual or historical, but I would call it socio-orthographic. Navet argues that word dividers co-evolved with writing itself. He writes that word division was systematically practiced in the formal Semitic writing from its very beginning, and it was left out in these inscriptions only because these are just graffiti. But the truth is, these are not graffiti. If you look at a sphinx like Sinai 345 or the seated scribe like Sinai 346, these are not graffiti. They might not be elegant inscriptions as we expect to find in Thebes itself or at Karnak, and they're not long literary texts, but a text of 7 lines written horizontally on a stela, which is another text that we have at Sinai in 349, is certainly not a graffiti. Graffito. And in fact, building on an observation by Richard Steiner, Steiner made the crucial observation that the absence of word dividers is not an isolated phenomenon here. In fact, the orthography here is incredibly shallow. The writing reflects the sounds of the language almost one-to-one, phoneme to grapheme system. And this sort of writing seems like a very intuitive way of beginning to write, and yet it's vastly different from writing systems that we are used to, not only from the modern world, but from the ancient world as well. So I want to raise the possibility that the writers here didn't mark the divisions between words because they actually didn't understand the concept of a word. That one might need literacy in order to conceptualize what a word is. The inventors of the alphabet made a lot of conceptual leaps in doing that. That's a topic for another discussion, but they may not have conceptualized what a word is. They invented a system that could transcribe sounds, and then they did exactly that. They thought to themselves what their speech sounded like, and they wrote it down. So this this raises the question of whether illiterate people or non-literate people are cognizant of the existence of the concept of words. In other words, what is the status of a word before we have writing? Now, of course, by its nature, this is a difficult question to address. How can we assess the reality of the concept word in societies that aren't literate? So one way of doing so is to look at societies that have only recently developed writing systems. And I think, looking quickly at them, in such cases, division of writing into words does not seem to emerge instinctively. There's no word divisions. There are no word divisions within the Cherokee syllabary developed in the 1820s by Sequoyah, or in the Vai script of Liberia, developed in the 1830s by Mamelu Dualu Bukele. There are no word divisions in Silas John's Apache script of the 20th century. In other words, when non-literate people develop writing systems, it is often the case, I certainly am not going to claim always, because I don't know enough to say something like that, but it's often the case that there are no divisions between words. Some of these cases are a little tricky because if a sign stands for a morpheme, that might be conceptualized as a word, but I'll stick with the claim for now anyway. In ancient languages, it's sometimes been observed that there are rarely words for word. In other words, Greek logos or Hebrew davar never means specifically word in a technical sense. It means something like speech. And it's hard to prove from languages themselves that these speakers actually had a concept of word. David Olson suggested that no one knew what words were until scribes introduced word dividers. Only once words were graphically isolated did the concept of word become clear. So I think that's probably overstated, but I say it because it's at least something that's so extreme that it should make us realize what is at least possible. Words, which we take for granted as being so intuitive, may actually not exist in an intuitive sense without writing, or at least not in the rigid way that we think of them. Now, writing itself does not necessarily produce any awareness of a word. So the Vai, for example, who were carefully studied by Sylvia Scribner and Michael Cole in the 70s, when they surveyed even the people who were literate in the Vai script, still don't have a clear sense of what a word is. But over centuries, there does seem to be a feedback loop between speakers' intuitions about words and orthographic practices. In other words, the idea of what a word is may antedate literacy only like very hazily, but orthographic knowledge influences spoken word recognition, and then vice versa. And we can see this both historically and developmentally. So coming back to the ancient world, the alphabetic scribes of the second millennium were not working in a world devoid of literacy. I'll come back to that in a second, sorry. Cuneiform does not mark the breaks between words. And if there are any skilled cuneiformists here, I'd be happy to hear if you have a different experience, but my admittedly not skilled experience in like the 3 years that I did cuneiform in graduate school was that in real texts, this is a real problem. One never knows when one's about to hit the end of a word until one's gotten there already. In other words, one has to identify the signs and then say, okay, that's the end of one word. Now starts the beginning of the next word. That's not how reading, normal reading in modern languages actually works. Modern languages, and almost, I shouldn't say all, but certainly European writing systems rely on spaces that cue our brains into knowing where a word's going to end long before we actually get there. And this is related to the big finding of saccades that researchers, especially Keith Rayner, pioneered back in the 1970s and 1980s, where we now know that our eyes don't travel smoothly across the lines of a text. I'm assuming that right now reading horizontally, even though it feels like they do. Instead, they jump from word to word, on average about 8 letters at a time. because we've already picked out from peripheral vision about how long the next word is, and our eyes jump to approximately the middle of the next word. We can see out of focus approximately 15 letters further to the right than where we're actually reading. So we know what's coming up. We don't know what it's going to say, but we know how many words are coming up and where to aim our eyes to take in the next word. But really important to emphasize that for that to work, our brain has to have visual cues that are obvious in our peripheral field of vision as to how long the next word or words are going to be, so we can know, okay, it's about half an inch long. It's about two centimeters. So I'm going to jump another centimeter to be in the middle of the word. So this, of course, this process relies on the existence of there being orthographic words marked in European scripts by a space on each side. Now, there's been some, it took a couple of decades, as is sort of often the case. It takes a couple of decades for the research to move out from English to other languages and other writing systems. So this was sort of well established in the 70s and 80s in English and European systems. And then researchers started to think like, well, what about other writing systems? How is this function in other writing systems? So there are writing systems, modern writing systems like Thai and Chinese, where there are no spaces. So in fact, researchers have found that the reading in this sense, saccades actually are less efficient in orthographies that don't have spaces. But it doesn't have to be specifically spaces. And this is really important for thinking about ancient writing systems. I hope it's bold enough for you to see the middle line here. When it says words were alternating bold and not bold, reading speeds were comparable. In other words, it doesn't have to be spaces in particular, but some sort of visual cue as to where a word is going to end is enough for our brains to then focus the eyes appropriately and pick out the words just as efficiently. And I unfortunately don't know any Japanese, so I'm happy again to hear from those here who might understand this better than I do. But researchers have found that in Japanese, sorry, where hiragana, where the writing of the word would be in hiragana, but a kanji character would be at the end of a word, the presence of that kanji character is enough to clue the brain in that we're coming up to the end of a word, so that's where you know where to stop. That's enough of a clue of a word boundary. Now, again, cuneiform doesn't have any of these. So cuneiform in this sense is actually an inefficient reading system. Hieroglyphs, on the other hand, do have signs that I think might serve this purpose. And those are the determinatives, what used to be called determinatives, which and what Orly Goldwasser and others call classifiers, which show up at the end of words. I unfortunately didn't mark all of them here. I just sort of had a thought to do that this morning, so marked a few. But the classifiers are hieroglyphs that, to a trained scribe or reader, will clue you in that this is the end of a word coming up. And so the brain will know to focus on the middle of the following word and could potentially read at comparable speeds as if there were spaces. Again, so cuneiform is actually something of a mystery to me, that its traditionalism or its scribal practices did not mark divisions between words. This is a real disadvantage in reading. And so, it made me feel a little bit better that I never got fluid in reading. Like maybe it's actually not easy to read fluidly, but it is something of a historical mystery then as to why they never developed such practice. There were in the old Assyrian texts from ancient Kanesh, modern Koltepe, up in Cappadocia, there are simple wedges used to divide words in cuneiform text. And this is something that we find often, that a practice that is non-canonical but exists on the margins of scribal culture is a practice that's useful but essentially banned from official use by convention. But I'll have to leave that aside for now. When we come back to early alphabetic texts, we realize that the very shallow orthography, including not just the lack of spaces between words, but even the lack of division between words, is an obstacle to easy reading of alphabetic texts. So it's not surprising that within centuries, word division begins to be used. I hope you can see this here. There's at least one example, or one probable example, on a sherd from a site called Tel Nagila in the 16th century. But here in the bowl from Lachish, from Lachish in the 13th century, you see it says Bishloshet, and then there's a little marker dividing one word from the next, followed by the next word. From the same century, also in Lachish, we have the use of 3 dots to divide words on a ewer. And this one is actually interesting, but I don't have time to dwell on that more. And at the same, again, in the same century, up in Ugarit, where there is a full alphabetic cuneiform developed, the vertical stroke, and again, I just circled a few of them here, is used to divide words in this new writing system. So most late bronze and then Iron Age texts show some marker of word division: 3 dots, 1 dot, a wedge, a line, something. And while it's easy to observe the introduction of word dividers, it's much more difficult to figure out the rules, systematic rules for their use. This is the earliest Aramaic text we have from Tel Fakhariya up in very, very northern Syria, where you see the use of 2 dots to divide words systematically. In biblical Hebrew, and I don't have to dwell on this, I'm not sure if it's useful. In biblical Hebrew, there are rules for what's considered a separate word or not a separate word. So essentially, one letter, what we might call words, have to be cliticized orthographically. So the definite article, for example, which is simply the letter hey with a vowel and gemination, has to be written together with the following word. One letter prepositions have to be cliticized. They have to be marked as part of the next word. They can't be written independently as their own word. In inscriptions, we find less consistency. We find things like construct phrases, geminate expressions, where we have, for example, House of David, even though house is its own word, written often with word dividers before and after, and David is its own word, written again with word dividers before and after. But when you have a genitive construction, I'm not sure if I just said geminate or genitive, but genitive construction, Beit David or Dawid, there we get it written without a word divider. Or Bir Beor, son of Beor, same. And a few more examples. So these kind of constructions where the scribes obviously felt that these words were particularly closely connected, they dropped the word divider in between. Interestingly, on the other direction, we sometimes get what we think of as suffixes, direct object suffixes, separated from the verbs with word dividers. Not only verbs, but nouns as well. So what I would conclude from all of this is simply that even though by the time we get to the late Bronze and Iron Age, early scribes recognized the existence of words, the category of what a word was still a fuzzy category. Of course, the fact that it's a fuzzy category doesn't mean that the category didn't exist. It simply means that it was fuzzy around its edges. And we still have in inscriptions also the double duty letters, like we saw in Mu'hab Ba'alat back in Sirab al-Khadim. We have words written where actually, if we took it apart to make 2 different words, one letter turns out to be serving both as the last letter of the first word and as the first letter of the second word. So there are examples here for those who want to look at those. Now, spaces, just to sort of round out the story here, spaces we see systematically in use in an ostrakon that comes to us in Aramaic from Ashur, from the middle of the 7th century BCE, so this is up in northern Mesopotamia. And from that point on, spaces become the norm in Aramaic writing, and then in the rest of Northwest Semitic writing as well. So here's my conclusion to this point, and then I'm going to try to expand on this a little bit quickly in the last section here. So my preliminary conclusion here is that the early alphabet, which did none of this division between words, was good for a very narrow purpose: simple transcription of short words and phrases. But it was not well suited for reading, and certainly not for reading long texts. And now I'll add that there are two other aspects of the early alphabet that push in the same direction: the shapes of characters and the absence of vowels. And I'm just going to look at these very briefly. Across writing systems, researchers have found that signs, the signs themselves, tend to share certain features. So they often start very complex, but become simplified over the course of their histories. They tend to be organized around lines in the two cardinal directions, up, down, right, left. And they tend to be symmetrical on the vertical axis, that letters like A and T are twice as frequent as letters like B and E. And I know some of the people mentioned here on that slide have given talks in the SCRIBO seminar series, and I've learned a lot from their talks in addition to their writing. Now, if you look at the early alphabetic signs, like again going back to Wadi al-Hol, we find that this violates pretty much every one of those rules. So these are highly iconic. They are not symmetrical. They are not simple. They're not compressed at all. It's often said that the general trend towards compression of signs into simpler signs is because of the pressure of writing. Scribes need to write faster. But equally important, maybe even more important actually, is the pressure of reading. The brain needs to process a sign quickly and easily. And a highly predictable symmetrical sign organized along the two main axes and symmetrical right to left are much easier for the brain to process than things like this. Now, of course, there are exceptions to these general trends. Hieroglyphs are a prime example. Islamic calligraphy, Maya texts have certainly resisted the trends towards compression and simplification. But Egyptian writing is actually a fantastic example that proves the rule. The intricate, complicated hieroglyphs were retained for display purposes, temple walls, tombs. But for everyday reading and writing, hieratic script was developed, and that really does accord with much of the predictions of researchers. So in the early alphabet, again, the key point that I want to make is that I suppose it would take longer to establish this more conclusively, but hope the key claim is that the shape of the letters also make this system quite bad for reading. I can ask you this, like, for example, this sign, this little guy over here with the two legs pointing to the left, is that the same sign or a different sign than this guy over here, where the two arms are up and the bottom leg is to the right? So if it's the same sign, then apparently you're allowed to do a lot of different things. It's likely that it's a different sign, but the fact that you have to look carefully at it to tell the difference between these signs is an example of what makes this writing system inefficient for reading. Yeah, all right. So Stanislas Dehaene, who's a wonderful researcher on reading, makes the point, I should have included this formulation: we did not invent most of our letter shapes. They lay dormant in our brains for millions of years, were merely rediscovered when our species invented writing in the alphabet. The second thing, the second additional point that I'll add is the absence of vowels. It's, I think the most famous thing about the early alphabet and alphabets for much of their history is that they don't mark vowels, or at least don't fully mark vowels. Without spending more time on this, many researchers simply note this as a difference. Greek introduces vowels. Semitic doesn't need vowels. I have, a list of articles and books that say things like that. That because of the structure of Semitic, they could get away without writing vowels. So I would argue, and again, it would take more time to argue this fully, but argue that's simply not true. It's actually a disadvantage in Semitic as well not to mark vowels, and the writing system would have been improved by the introduction of vowels. So when Greek introduces vowels, that is a step forward within the history of the alphabet, not just because Greek is different and so it needs vowels. That's probably true, but that Semitic also would have been improved by the introduction of vowels. My evidence for that, I'll just say very quickly, comes from two directions. First of all, the history of Semitic writing systems themselves. They repeatedly introduce vowels. So that indicates that there is pressure internally to have vowels. It's perceived by users of the writing systems as a deficiency that vowels are not there. And two, we have experiments, obviously recent experiments, on the efficiency of reading different writing systems. And it turns out that if you add vowels into a script like Hebrew, Arabic's a little trickier, but certainly Hebrew, that efficiency actually does rise. So here's the key argument that I want to make, that three important aspects of the early alphabetic writing, the lack of division between words, the shape of the letters, and the lack of vowels, all lead to the same conclusion, that this is an incredibly easy system to write because all you have to do is listen to the sounds in your head and write down what you hear, but it is an extraordinarily difficult writing system to read. And so I said I would come back to this. I think that's actually one reason why many of the early alphabetic texts are not fully deciphered. One reason is it's really not easy to read. There's a lot of considerations, of factors that are stacked against us trying to make sense of them, because the scribes were actually not using a system that was meant to be read easily by anyone else. So even though we know enough about Northwest Semitic in the second millennium BCE, we know the letters, and yet we're having trouble figuring out what the text means, is I think a fault of the writing system itself. So given all this, how were the early alphabetic inscriptions read? Well, there are two basic possibilities. One is that the pressure was taken off of the visual brain, at least, to recognize words because the texts were read out loud. So this is, I'm drawing here from the, I think, quite well-known work of Paul Senger, who showed that the norm in the classical world in antiquity was for oral reading, and he connected that method of reading to the practice of writing with no spaces. And the key insight is that when one reads aloud, the oral experience allows the reader to make sense of a text, even though the graphic representation of a text is difficult to decode. And I would say that's almost certainly the case for a cuneiform. So if you imagine a cuneiform scribe getting a text or a letter, we have to assume that they read it out loud, and that that's to a large extent the answer to why they didn't feel the pressure to graphically divide words, because their reading aloud allowed them to process the text even without those visual cues. All right, putting aside some of the other details, there's a second possibility, though, with regard to the early alphabetic texts, which is that these texts were simply never meant to be read at all, at least not by mortals. I said earlier that they're not graffiti, but what they are, certainly the more formal ones, are dedicatory inscriptions found in and around the temple of Hathor at Sirab el-Khadam. And the intended audience of these texts is a goddess who can presumably read even a poor writing system. And so this then yields what I think is an important conclusion, which is that the alphabet is in fact badly designed for efficient reading of long texts because it is not designed for that purpose at all. So what I want to say about that slightly more generally is that it's not fair to say that the alphabet is a good or bad writing system, or that any writing system is good or bad, because the assessment of a technology has to be context dependent. Stephen Christomalis, who I heard his talk I guess a couple months ago now, talks about this in his recent book with regard to the decline of Roman numerals, which didn't decline as fast as one might have expected. And Christomalis makes the point that well, how fast you expect them to decline depends on what you think numbers are used for. And we have to take that into account in thinking about whether the system of Roman numerals was a good or bad system. I think similar, sort of conceptually, Richard Bulliet's argument about the decline of the wheel in Arabia in particular, but the Middle East more generally, for a couple of thousand years, again, reminds us that it's not a question of whether the wheel is a good or a bad invention. It's actually a silly question. The question is it good for a particular purpose? And we have to know more about the purpose that something is being used for in order to assess whether something is good or bad for that purpose. Christomalis actually gives a parable of the tools. And so I would, adopting his parable, I would say that criticizing the early alphabet for not being easily readable is sort of like criticizing a screwdriver for not being a better hammer. It just wasn't designed for that. It was designed for something else. What was it designed for? It was designed for the simple writing of short texts by people on the margins of society who otherwise couldn't write. And again, this is, I think, why now, more than 100 years after the first texts were discovered, few of them are fully deciphered. They just weren't made to be read. So what were they good for? Not literature. They were good for short graffiti. They were good for dedicatory inscriptions, which didn't need to be reread. They were good for labels. I could write my own name on something and know whose it was. The history of the first millennium or so of the alphabet is that uses begin to proliferate. So people start to adapt the technology of the alphabet, and in adapting it for a new use, they also need to adapt it not just functionally, but also in terms of its technology. So we start to get word dividers very early on. We start to get vowel letters fairly early on. The letters become simplified fairly quickly. So Dehaene, again, writes that our writing systems changed under the constraint that even a primate brain had to find them easy to acquire. And I think that's absolutely right. But the point is that when we look at the early alphabet, we simply have to give it time for that to work. So we look at our modern writing systems and we say, oh, look, they're so well adapted to our brains that, of course, the findings of modern researchers can show that they have evolved in order to make use of the pre-existing functions that our brains are good at. The very early alphabet simply hasn't had a chance to actually evolve in those ways. So we need to give it a few centuries. 500, 600, 700 years later, it's taken its first big steps towards being a good writing system for sort of regular reading and writing. And by the time we get to 1,000 years later, you can write anything. We get whole literature, not just royal inscriptions, but actually whole books, literary texts, and so on, in the alphabet. For the first few hundred years, though, and this is the last point I'll make, it really stays only around the margins, only doing very, very marginal things. So one of the surprising finds of the last decade or so is this these little dockets on the edge of cuneiform tablets from the first Sealand dynasty, so in the middle of the second millennium BCE, where cuneiform tablets, you can see the scratching on the top and the inked-in version on the bottom. Cuneiform tablets have linear alphabetic inscriptions on the side that simply mark the name of someone who is mentioned in the text or who the text is about. These are legal texts. Or this little astrakhan from Thebes from the 15th century, which combines Egyptian and alphabetic writing. And by the time we get to about 1000 BCE, the alphabet has geographically spread throughout the Near East. So we have the Ugaritic alphabet up in Syria on the Mediterranean coast. We have some short texts in the Levant, a growing number of short texts in the Levant. We have this astrakhan down in Thebes. We have off in the Sealand dynasty. Actually, I should have included as well down in Yemen. We already have writing in Yemen around the year 1000 BCE as well. But all of this, it takes time for the alphabet to develop into uses other than very short graffiti whose function is essentially exhausted by the writing itself. So just the last conclusion is that the alphabet, which was originally a simplistic system developed for writing short inscriptions and graffiti, really nothing more at all, was adapted in ways that enabled it to spread throughout the world, throughout Europe, in which, of course, books and journals can be written in hundreds of languages. But that takes a lot of time. And when we think about it, this is really a familiar pattern. In other words, there's an invention for one reason that then over time, sometimes vast expanses of time, is adapted for other purposes. So just one other quick example, people domesticated animals thousands of years before they realized the economic potential inherent in domesticated flocks. And Andrew Sherratt termed this the secondary products revolution about about 4000 BCE, that the, I'm sorry, no, 6th millennium BCE, that the secondary products revolution included the development of using animals to pull plows, consuming milk, production of wool, pack transport. Now that makes the original revolution, the initial domestication of animals 10,000 years ago, look more dramatic than it really was. But it takes time for the full potential of that invention to be realized. And my argument is that the same is true for the alphabet. The beginnings of the alphabet have the potential for great radical developments, but those take a long time to realize, many centuries and up to about a millennium to fully realize. So in retrospect, those first steps taken around 2000 BCE look like a dramatic turn of events. In their own context, they're really a very marginal turn of events. But over the with the adaptations introduced over the coming centuries, the revolutionary potential was realized, and then in retrospect, that does look like a more dramatic development. All right, so I'll end there.
Thank you so much, Aaron. It was truly lovely. I have so many questions actually. Can I start off and then leave the other questions to the floor? Well, where to start actually in such a thought-provoking talk you gave us. I was wondering, the necessity to divide words in a marked way, you seem to suggest that the reason for that well, I don't really know whether you are suggesting that you can pinpoint a reason for that happening, to be honest with you, but maybe there is a functional explanation that has to do with the fact that early invented writing doesn't need to divide words because they are inherently divided by the morphemic boundaries that you find, and the possibility of using one sign to represent a morpheme, a whole morpheme, creates a natural separation and division between words. And so the concept of word, which is so elusive for us as linguists, perhaps was not so elusive and slippery then. And then when you mention the alphabetic cuneiform from Ugarit, it really sort of lit up a bulb in my head, because the necessity to have that, or the functionality of the division marker in that context, may have to do, although clearly the alphabet in Ugarit was exposed and developed from that exposure to cuneiform in sort of, Akkadian, Sumerograms and all of that tradition, may have to do with the fact that if finally in that context you have an alphabetic script in which the strings of letters are longer, and therefore it's much more difficult to pinpoint word boundaries as a result of the fact that the words are longer. And therefore the striking distancing from the Akkadian syllabographic cuneiform has to do with that long string. In other words, is there a way that the alphabet has an inherent necessity for that word division to happen because it's a segmental type of script, which is the marked difference that you have from whatever happened before?
Yeah, so I think I partially agree with you. And I think that's absolutely true about the alphabet. I don't think, so in a language like Sumerian, which where essentially a morpheme and a syllable match up, which is very important for thinking about the invention of writing to begin with in the Near East, then I think what you're saying makes sense. Maybe scribes didn't feel the need to distinguish one word for the next because each morpheme is essentially one syllable and it sort of stands on its own. But Akkadian and Egyptian don't work that way. So by our conventions, you can get an Akkadian word that's written in 6 signs or something. You take a verb that has 3 root letters, and then you're going to add a causative prefix onto it and an object suffix onto it and clitic ending onto it, and you make it a very, very long word. And they still don't seem to feel a need to mark it. Now, there are certain signs that only occur at the end of words. So once you get to it, you would realize that you're at the end of a word.
And you also have a pre-existing tradition, which is the Sumerian one, which doesn't use that. And obviously it's a direct borrowing of that tradition as a whole package. And then you have the category of determinatives, which point in one direction and therefore give you actually an indication of where the boundary is. So it's much more sort of intrinsically tied to a pre-existing tradition that shapes and colors whatever it is that they do
exactly right.
in Akkadian.
And that's what I was trying to get at when I said that the sort of mentioned very quickly that up in Kanesh and the old Assyrian trading colony up in Turkey, you do find word dividers in cuneiform. And that's amazing because that's very early on. We're talking old Assyrian, early second millennium. The key point seems to be not linguistic, but just cultural. They're not in a scribal center. They have a very simplified writing system. And so freed of the necessity to follow the rules where we don't mark word dividers, they mark word dividers because it's helpful to mark word dividers. But of course, in the centers, that's in the periphery. The centers, that never catches on because here we have rules, we have traditions. And I don't mean to mock it, but it's of course a real part of scribal tradition. Egyptian, I think you're right. I think Egyptian is much. I'm to some extent projecting my own experience on ancient scribes, but I think it's true that Egyptian is much easier to read in part because there are signs that with enough practice, your eyes actually pick up as being classifiers, being determinatives, and say, okay, that's the end of a word. I know what's coming up. But you're right that the alphabet absolutely is useless without it. I mean, it's very hard to write. There's just no breaks whatsoever in an alphabetic text without those word dividers. Of course, the Latin writers wrote it, and Greek writers did that also, and that's something of that's where Senger's hypothesis of oral reading becomes relevant. But it's I think that's certainly true. That the writing system actually, different writing systems in different languages have different pressures that they exert on the writing system.
Indeed, it's so very contextual, and you're very right to pinpoint the fact that there is no good or bad writing system inherently, but it's all context dependent. Let me open up to the floor, and then I will ask my questions at the end, perhaps if we have time. Does anybody want to ask a question? You can raise your hand, or you can unmute yourself, or you can use the chat and write it down. Let me read. There's one from Andreas Fools. Let me read it aloud for you, Aaron. In logosyllabic writing such as Maya, hieroglyphic, Japanese, and cuneiform writing, logograms are often accomplished by phonetic signs to indicate the correct reading. Thereby, a logogram does not always indicate the border of a word. In proto-Biblos writing, some texts use word divider on spatula, but longer texts on monuments and bronze tablets do not. Do you have any explanation for this fact?
So these are separate, I assume. So the first one, that's a very good point, right? So the fact that something is by itself a logogram or morphogram doesn't actually mean that it's going to stand on its own. You still might have 2 or 3 signs for a word. Thank you. Good point. I unfortunately don't know Maya or Japanese, so I'll assume that it's true for those as well as cuneiform. The Biblos writing, I don't have any explanation for this fact. We can make one up. I'm sort of hesitant to make things up until I've worked a bit on those texts, and I think some of the work that has been done on those texts has been more productive than some other people have thought. And I think we do have some of that deciphered, not like Mendenhall thought, but anyway. But that's a great point. I mean, I think the relevant questions are, or at least I would hypothesize that the relevant questions are exactly in terms of reading and not reading and types of reading for thinking about word dividers. So if something is set up in a temple as a monumental inscription, which I know, monumental in these Proto-Biblian writings is not the same as, let's say, Egyptian monumental, but still, it's a dedicatory inscription in a temple, where we're assuming that the readers are primarily, if anyone's reading it, it's gods, everyone else is supposed to simply be impressed by the writing, sort of see it visually, but not actually read it out loud, then that lack of functional need to read, I think, is a key point to thinking about the lack of word dividers. That doesn't explain why we would have them on the spatula. That's a really interesting observation. I don't know. Think more about that. That's yeah, really interesting example.
Any live questions, please, by raising your hand or unmuting yourselves.
This is Tom. I was curious. I have kind of followed a direction that the Proto-Semitic letters are illustrations using hand gestures. And I noticed that the hey that you showed in one word had two differing usages. In one, the left hand was down and the right hand was up, and the other, both hands were up. Right. And I was wondering if that might suggest that by the position of the hands in that type of a gesture, and there was also a difference in the knee in that gesture as well. But I was wondering if that suggests that maybe there's some unwritten letters there that by using gestures, they were maybe presenting three letters at once or a combination of letters rather than it being just one letter.
By letters, do you mean consonants, or do you mean that the vowels would have been marked in some way by these little variations?
I'm thinking more in terms of consonants, but like the conjoined words, like combining with a left with the right hand and a lamed with the left hand would have kind of the L or all symbol with the hey, and if there are some combinations of letters that are like conjoined words, like you gave examples with at the very beginning.
Well, so I sort of have to give the caveat that since those Wadi al-Hol inscriptions are not conclusively deciphered, I can't be sure of anything. But I'll say that assuming that these are in the tradition, sort of in the family of alphabetic scripts that we know better from Sarabit, and then later, of course, from Ugarit and the Levant and so on, what becomes the Hebrew and Phoenician and Aramaic scripts, we don't find anything like that in those traditions. The usual claim, in fact, is that the whole radicalism of the alphabet is that it's the inventors have actually reduced each sign to being just one sound. Of course, in cuneiform or in hieroglyphs, any sign could stand for, in cuneiform, CV or CVC. In hieroglyphs, you have things, we don't have the vowels, but could certainly be for 3 consonants. But the alphabet seems to have been distinguished specifically by rejecting that and reducing each sign to just standing for one consonantal sound. We do have later alphabets, right? The Ethiopic script, which is a syllabary in the sense that it takes the basic consonantal sign and then with little modifications marks which vowel follows it. So people like Gelb have wondered whether the early alphabet should also be classified as a syllabary rather than as an alphabet. And you've probably, many of you have probably come across the term abjad, which Peter Daniels introduced to sort of hedge his bets. And this is not a full alphabet like Greek, but it's not a syllabary like Ethiopic. It's somewhere in between and marks only consonants. I have nothing against the term. I would just say that for all sorts of conceptual arguments that I won't get into now, I think an abjad is a type of an alphabet. So great term, but it's not as opposed to an alphabet. It's a type of an alphabet. But to your point, it's, again, so with the caveat that, like, hey, if your hypothesis winds up deciphering the inscriptions, happy to take it. But it would go against what seemed to be the conceptual underpinnings of the alphabet from the beginning, which is specifically that each sign represents one consonantal sound. Now, your point about the shapes, though, is really, it's an important point, because either there was a lot of variety possible in the shapes of these signs. And like you say, the guy can be like this or like this, and the legs can be in different positions, or actually those simply mark different signs, different sounds. I'm sorry, right. But that it would combine different consonantal signs would seem to violate the whole basic idea of what the alphabet was at the beginning. But again, I say that sort of not tentatively, because I think it's probably right, but with the asterisk that until it's fully deciphered, we should keep any possibility on the table.
We have a question from Maroon K.
So I have just a couple of things to say. Why do we have to apply a modern conception word to something that dates for millennia?
Okay.
For the Sarabat al-Khadim interpretation, why do we have to suppose that it's matan li ba'lat, not metal ba'lat, a compound name, not based on the root matan or yatun? This is one, I guess, and also it goes for the second one. Why muhib ba'lat should we suppose there is 2b and not one word? Compound of two. Compound of compound on two elements. Okay, the third one, the Phoenicians didn't need to define words. Example, Ashmonazor 2 inscription, where there's no separation, and as we can notice in the oldest inscription, yes, there is a separation, but later on it actually disappeared. Thank you.
Thank you. Great. So, okay, I'll try to take those one at a time. So let me actually start with the middle question. So of course, the Mu'hab Ba'alat is actually the easiest one, because that expression appears at Sarabat, I don't remember exactly the number of times, maybe 5 or 6 times in different inscriptions. Sometimes does have a double B. So sometimes it's actually written as Mu'hab Ba'alat, and sometimes it's written with only one B. So that one is actually internal evidence that the B is serving double duty. So we see it written out with the 2 B's and other texts right nearby. Of course, conceivably one could argue that these don't mean the same thing, but certainly it seems simpler to assume that there's simply 2 different writings of the same expression. Which were phonetically equivalent. In other words, the writers heard Mu'hab Ba'alat, but whereas some writers wrote it with only one B, hearing the gemination but not marking that as separate. Other writers wrote it as 2 B's. Actually, for my purposes, it's the 2 B's that are interesting, because it seems like the only reason to write it with 2 B's is because of some sort of understanding on the part of the writer that this is 2 words and I should separate them. Even though I hear only one geminated B, I'm going to write the B twice. What I wouldn't do in the middle of a word, I will do here at a word juncture. So that's probably the simplest one. Matal Ba'alat. Again, the word matan shows up in other inscriptions, so it's not I can't say it's absolutely certain that it's the phrase matan Ba'alat, but it certainly fits the context well, fits what we know about the dialect well. In other words, they use the word matan to mean gift, and fits the actual inscription itself, because this is a little dedicatory inscription on a statue positioned at the temple of Hathor. So it makes good sense, but it's I can't say anything more conclusive than that. Sometimes I'm jealous of people who actually have a lot of data and can say things conclusively. So that's with regard to those inscriptions, but I certainly agree that it's a matter of philology to try to puzzle out what the best reading of those inscriptions is. In terms of your first question, that's really a key question. So it's not only a modern concept of what a word is. So ancient scribes introduced word dividers relatively quickly in the scheme of things. I mean, relatively quickly meaning 500-600 years later, we see word dividers. We see them in the Lachish bulls and Ur. We see them consistently at Ugarit. And of course, earlier, we see them in non-alphabetic systems. So Cuneiform is a bad example, but hieroglyphs has word dividers from the early 3rd millennium. We wouldn't call them, Egyptologists don't call them word dividers. They're not dots or spaces, but those classifiers or determinatives mark the ends of words. And there are specific ways, specific rules for how to write words in Egyptian. You don't just sound it out. Homonym, or at least what seem to us to be homonyms, have different rules for how to write each word, depending on the meaning, depending on the form, and so on. So the concept of word is not a modern concept, but it is, and that's what I'm sort of fumbling to try to articulate, is that it's not a modern concept. It's not clear how salient a concept it is before there's writing in a society. But once a society begins to write, there begins to be a process towards which in which words are formalized and regularized. And again, I think there's a feedback loop. So I think actually my impression, but I don't have the experiments to prove it, is that non-literate people actually do have an intuitive sense of what a word is. Because all you have to do is mix up different sentences, and you realize that a particular string of sounds can show up in the same sentence surrounded by different sounds. So I can take the word, I don't know, walk, and I can say, I walked to the store today, and I can say, she walks to my house tomorrow, and I realize that sound string, walk, has now reappeared in different contexts, and everything around it has changed. So I start to intuitively understand that this is something that can be isolated and moved around. So I think that non-literate people actually have an intuitive sense of what a word is, but once you start writing, then you might have to develop rules for that in order to regularize it. And then there's a feedback loop that goes back and forth. But I do want to insist that it's not a modern concept. It is something that is certainly found in ancient writing systems, and therefore in ancient speakers' minds as well. In later Hebrew, so I mentioned that biblical Hebrew has a word davar, which is very similar to Greek logos in its sort of semantic range, which of course I played on in the title of the talk. In the beginning, there was no word, but in later Hebrew, in the Hebrew of the Mishnah, Rabbinic Hebrew, the word for graphic word, is actually the word teva, which originally meant a box. So this is a term that clearly thinks of a word as something physical and graphic. A teva is a word, and it's, there's all these rules of scribal culture that are given. But that's to your first question about the modern. It's really not a modern concept. It is an ancient concept, although I think you're certainly right that it was fuzzier in ancient world than in the modern world. And your third point about Phoenician, yeah, that's a great observation. I've long wondered whether this is something about the Greek and later Latin contexts of the later Phoenician inscriptions. But you're right that the Iron Age Phoenician inscriptions have word dividers, and that seems to be the sort of expected find. That they're there. They're there in the Achiroman sarcophagus inscription. They're there in all the Iron Age inscriptions, and then they disappear. So for right now, I'll just leave that as an excellent observation, and I thank you for that, which I don't have a great explanation for.
Of course, we shouldn't stress the idea that the absence of word dividers points to the absence of the concept of a word. Obviously, they shouldn't go together as a sort of any more questions? I will let people think and ask my own. The earliest attestations of the alphabet in Sarabit al-Khadem and Wadi al-Khol, as you say, are very difficult to read, easier to write, but then it begs the question of who would actually be the sort of recipient or the addressee of all of those. They're not jotted down just for the sake of being jotted down. They serve a possible function, whatever it is, be they used as graffiti, be they used as dedication. Somebody must have had the interest or the sort of, the contextual interest in actually reading them. So who would they be? And this kind of ties with the context in which these inscriptions are conceived and invented and written down, you seem to suggest, or you actually suggest quite overtly, that it is a context of illiteracy, and this is a little bit of a contested or much discussed hot topic. So could you please tie up these two sort of strands of questions together and give us a more contextual view of what happened there and then at the end of the third millennium?
Oh, second. Yeah, it's, well, yes and no. So on the one hand, your first point, I'm actually not sure that there are readers envisioned. There is Egyptian writing as well, right? We have hundreds of Egyptian hieroglyphic texts from Sirab al-Khadim. They're not the most beautiful Egyptian inscriptions because we're often Sirab al-Khadim, but there are hundreds of them. That's why these are Sinai 345 and 346. Is the first 340 or so were the numbers for the Egyptian inscriptions found at Sirab, and even numbers 400 and on is also Egyptian inscriptions. So what seems likely is that I should say that Orly Goldwasser has argued that the inscription that the alphabet was invented at Sirab al-Khadim. I see very little reason to assume that that's true. Sirab is later, by convention. I mean, it's hard to be 100% sure, but the Wadi al-Hol inscriptions are conventionally dated a couple of centuries earlier than Sirab al-Khadim. Orly thinks that the Sirab al-Khadim is maybe a little bit earlier than most people think, but still, the fact that we happen to have inscriptions from here doesn't, of course, mean that that's where it was invented. So I don't assume that the alphabet was invented here. And yet the social context, as Goldwasser describes it, is I think, quite important. So we have Semitic miners who for centuries were involved in the Egyptian mining operations in the Sinai. Egyptians used local labor for transport, for probably military protection, and for the mining itself. And these Semitic workers see the Egyptians who can put up inscriptions and say things like, thanks to the gods, I have come here and I have done the following, and I am such a wonderful overseer of the mining operations with the whatever, and they're sort of moderately flowery language. And some of the Semitic miners are like, well, we would like to do something like that. I mean, we also want to thank our goddess for the help and the success in this temple, but we can't because we can't write. So they see the Egyptian writing and take from the Egyptians the idea of writing, and they take some of the shapes of the signs, but they radically depart from Egyptian writing in constructing this writing system. Again, this doesn't have to happen at Sirab, wherever it first happened. But I'm not sure that they ever imagined it as being read, because they're not dealing with a scribal culture where they're writing letters to other people or they're writing inscriptions that they hope someone else will come and find. All they want to do is write their name and a brief message on a little statue or a little sphinx that they're dedicating to the goddess, or they literally just want to write, we were here, we worked here. And for this, the much more important part is the writing, not the reading. I think this is something that, for me, took a very long time to wrap my head around, because we think of writing as simply the prerequisite for reading. Like, the point is to read. We need to write in order for someone else to read.
Not necessarily, and I do agree with you that we should broaden our view of what writing does. There's such a thing as, I don't know who came up with this definition, but I think it's brilliant, iconic literacy. You just see that it's reading, right, that it's writing, sorry, but there's no presupposition that you should read it. It's not as closely as the expectation that we may have as a projection. Clearly, we should broaden our view of what, how writing was perceived back then. But it's just interesting to see that, they had sort of an impulse towards writing. They did use it, and then to see that there's no end result, or we can't even hypothesize what the end result of the destination was is slightly more slippery, more elusive, which is very odd. I mean, I wonder whether we can't read them. We can't read this very tiny group of inscriptions. I loved it that you called it a large group, a large corpus. Well, clearly it's not. I mean, of what, 30 inscriptions altogether, considering.
Something like that, yeah.
That, you know, we can't read it because we can't read it, but then are we projecting our own inability to read onto them, and they could easily instead read them? I mean, is there a sort of a...
But I think that's actually the usual assumption. The usual assumption is that, you know, our lack of understanding of them is simply our fault. You know, we haven't yet figured it out. But like everyone else, you know, at the time, of course, they could read it. And I actually want to suggest that actually, you know, we can't read them because it's just not a writing system that was designed to be read well. It doesn't mean that we should stop trying. I mean, still conceivably, if we figured out the right keys, we should be able to figure out. So maybe there's a lot more double duty letters. Maybe there's a lot more assimilation than we realized. Things of that sort. But we should be able to, you know, puzzle them out. Yeah, I think it might be structural. I did want to just come back to your second point about the literacy. So the short version is that, you know, the conventional wisdom had always been that the inventors of the alphabet knew Egyptian hieroglyphs. Goldwasser is the one who said, actually, I think they saw Egyptian hieroglyphs but didn't understand Egyptian hieroglyphs. She got like a lot of negative responses, but honestly, a lot of the responses like haven't really gotten to the heart of the question. Like, how could we decide? How could we actually assess this question? That's actually a hard question to assess. And my suggestion is that the best way of assessing this is actually to look at the structures of the writing systems. Something like what I'm sketching out here today, let me put it this way. If you know what a word is, then it's very hard to forget what a word is when you invent a new writing system. The inventors of the alphabet seem to have a very fuzzy idea of what words are. And I would suggest that that actually is an argument in favor of their former illiteracy. Because if they actually knew hieroglyphs, then they've already been trained to think in terms of words. But they don't seem to be thinking in terms of words. They seem to be thinking in terms of sounds alone. So that's a kind of structural argument that's not based on sort of social arguments like, well, only scribes can write and things like, which is sort of what's often said. Like, well, let's look at the actual systems and see if there's evidence internal to the systems as to whether they seem to be familiar with Egyptian writing or not. Unfortunately, I have arguments in the other direction also. So it's, I'm not yet sure what I think the bottom line answer is. But those arguments, I think, are actually much more interesting and compelling than sort of broad arguments about whether illiterate people can invent writing systems.
Oh, but they can. We know that they
exactly
can. We have so much evidence for that.
Exactly.
We have another question by Maroon. Maroon wants to ask another.
Yes, actually, I wanna discuss just the idea of writing in the temple or in the religious context is related to eternity. And it's mentioned in the royal inscription of Hiram and others that deleting his writing in the inscription of Hiram. So it's related to eternity. And if we look at the Egyptian history, Hatshepsut has her name deleted or, take it off.
Right.
So I don't think so that at least the invention of the alphabet has to be or was made by illiterate. It's religious, it's eternity, it's a high level of comprehension of life and its circle and so on. So I don't think so it can show up in an illiterate context. It's really religious, it's important, it's mentioned. So it's so subtle and so hasty to just assume illiterate context, at least for the invention of the alphabet.
Right, so
Thank you.
Religious and important are not the opposite of illiterate, though. There's people who are formerly illiterate who see that the Egyptians write their names, and their names, as you say, exist forever, right? So it doesn't matter if anyone reads them, but they have to be there forever. And they say, oh, well, that seems important. I want my name to be here forever. I'm not sure that's relevant to the question of whether the inventors were literate or illiterate. But I think your basic point is certainly an important point, that writing serves a function even if no one ever reads it. It does have to exist. In other words, by saying that it doesn't have to be read again, I didn't mean to imply that therefore they didn't care what happened to it afterwards. So there's writing on Achirome's sarcophagus, which is then buried in a tomb and sealed inside. He certainly doesn't expect anyone to ever read it, and yet he says, cursed be anyone who erases this. So obviously the writing has to exist and serves a function without at least any mortal readers. And that's of course true for a lot of Egyptian tomb inscriptions also. They're writing these long things, which we're very happy to have, but they were then sealed inside a tomb. They didn't expect any mortals to be reading this. So that's a very important point about a function of writing that doesn't assume readers and yet needs to exist and survive for a long time.
Yeah, we discussed this in our previous SCRIBO seminar related to the Aegean writing systems and the possibility of readers being there. There is a question in the chat. Have you analyzed the word length in early writing, and if the word length influences the use of word dividers? Yeah, it kind of relates to what I was saying earlier.
That's an interesting point. So I mean, I should say that I haven't actually done numbers. There are lots of short words that are marked as word dividers, but never one-letter words marked as with word dividers. So one of the problems is that our biggest corpus of early Northwest Semitic writing is the Hebrew Bible. But of course, the scribal traditions of the Hebrew Bible are much later than the text itself. So it's not possible to simply retroject and say, well, we have the text as we have it in 800-900 CE and assume that it would have looked quite the same 1500 years earlier. But it is interesting that in both Northwest Semitic inscriptions of the Iron Age and later Hebrew scribal rules, there's never allowed to be a one-letter word. So of course the Hebrew Bible uses spaces. Earlier inscriptions use word dividers before the spaces are invented, but never one letter. But there are lots of two-letter words. Many two-letter words, though, then there often are two-letter words that are joined to the following word, if it's a preposition or if it's a genitive construction. So the same word may appear somewhere marked by word dividers before and after, but other places without a word divider between that and the following word. So it's a good question. Meaning, it might be worth actually, writing down numbers and seeing if a pattern emerges as to how many words of what length appear. There certainly are short words and long words, but beyond that, yeah, I don't know. It's a good question.
Very interesting. Any more questions from anyone? Raising your hands possibly instead of writing in the chat, because we would like to hear your voices. Well, I'm going to ask my last question, Aaron. I haven't found an analysis of the signs in the Sarabit al-Khadem and Wadi al-Hol inscriptions that is, well, sort of gives a tentative reading of any of the signs, like especially the Wadi al-Hol, just a couple of signs are identified, like the ox head and the man shape, but that's it. And I'm really wondering, I mean, it's quite tantalizing that this is the state of the research. It's quite, surprising and tantalizingly curious that this is the state of the research. And I wonder, out of ignorance, whether there's anything that's been done that's more thorough.
No, I agree with you. I think I think you're right. That's both frustrating, and also at some point, I think what you're saying accurately is that then turns around to actually be a question in and of itself. In other words, well, why not? Why can't we make progress on something that is a grand total of 14 signs or 12 signs? Most of which are somewhat familiar to, about 75-80% of those signs are recognizably similar to later alphabetic signs where we know the phonemic value of them. So how hard could this be to then, write it down, play with the different possibilities, even if it takes a week to run through every single possibility by looking up every Semitic dictionary? Like, we're not talking about that many signs. So like, how hard could this be? So I think you're right that we're past the point where this is just a question of frustration. And at this point, it's actually a research question in and of itself. Like, what's wrong here? Are we wrong about the language? Maybe it's not Northwest Semitic. Are we wrong about the signs? Maybe they don't mark what we think they might mean. Are we wrong about the system? Maybe they don't work the way we think that they work. So I don't know. Those would obviously be very dramatic changes. My hypothesis, my sort of working hypothesis, because I haven't given up so far on some of those other assumptions, is that some of the things that I was talking about today are actually the reason why we haven't figured it out, because we're looking at it as if it were written in sort of full words.
Mm-hmm.
But we have to say, like, no, forget full words. What would have been the phonological reality that a writer would have heard? And that opens up all sorts of possibilities of assimilation, of gemination, of missing morphemes or phonemes here or there that like a scribe would have written, but this is not a scribe. This is someone like literally just listening to the speech in their head and writing down what they hear. And I think you can make a little bit of progress with that. Some of the Sarabit texts, I think, like the Matal Ba'alat, I think is a step forward once we take that. And there's other, what Maroon said is another reading that has been suggested, that this is someone's name, Mutil Ba'alat or something, which I think is just a worse reading. And it was created by people not realizing that the N may have been assimilated to the following preposition phonologically. So I think we can make a little bit of progress once we take these things into account. I'm hoping that we can make enough progress to show that this is really, it is Northwest Semitic. The signs really are working more or less the way we expect them to work. But there are some signs that really are enigmatic. I mean, even when the decipherers thought they were sure, I'm not sure. So there's a lot of layers of uncertainty here.
Mm-hmm.
But you're right. I mean, it's very frustrating. Obviously, the size of the corpus is not helpful, but it's
quite depressing, actually.
it's terrible.
I mean, we in the Aegean are used to working with a bunch of inscriptions, but this is quite.
No, it's terrible. I mean, look,
more meager.
It's always true. Look, I'll give you just a couple of more examples. So we have the those Byblos inscriptions that were mentioned earlier, where we have there's about
45.
8 or 9. Yeah, there's a longer text, but there's still only about 9 of them. We have a handful of texts from Der Allah in Jordan from the late Bronze Age, which have not yet been deciphered. Probably about 6 of them, all of which are 1 line each. They're like labels or of some sort. Very recently, actually, Glenn Schwartz published from El-Mara up in Syria, texts which he thinks are 24th century BCE alphabetic inscriptions, which would be by far the earliest alphabetic inscriptions we have. I mean, by about 500 years, and 1,000 miles away from where people think the alphabet was invented. So that would sort of blow a lot out of the water. So the date is, he says it was in a closed tomb. So he's sort of, he's pretty insistent on the date. But again, the decipherment is hard. We have 4 texts of like 5 letters each. I mean, these are the kind of corpora that we're dealing with. So it's very frustrating.
And I didn't even know about this latest find from Syria. Could you send me the reference? Or
of course.
Thank you. Yeah, no, it's quite depressing, actually.
But
but clearly, we shouldn't be deterred from the fact that so few inscriptions are tested.
Right.
Much more research is needed in this direction. It's
right. My next door neighbor in my office is she works on the early modern period, and she's a social historian. She deals with like boxes and boxes and boxes from archives, and she asks the smallest questions about what exactly was happening in the year 1620, and I'm like, we're happy if we know like what happened in the 19th century BCE. Like, one thing, like just name one thing. Yeah.
Any more questions? Your last chance before we say goodbye to Aaron. No more questions? I'm very pleased to see that lots of my students are here, so thank you.
Nice.
My dear students, for being here. Thank you, Aaron. It was, oh no, there's one. He says, from modern software, we know the function of word completion after entering the first letters of a word. In a similar manner, a trained reader of early writing may recognize words by just looking at the first few letters. Do you think that this could be used instead of word dividers?
That's a great point. This is, again, I think, going to be very language specific. So in Semitic, it's very hard to imagine this working because so much will come from the conjugation of the verb or the suffixes that may be on the noun or the adjective or the verb. So even if you have a sense of what's to come, you couldn't just guess at the rest. You would have to actually go check to see the rest of it and see if there's, again, how is this verb conjugated? Is there a long oo at the end instead of a short oo? That makes all the difference in the world in terms of the grammar of the sentence. Is there an object suffix at the end? So that's a good point. I think you're right. Also, I'm not sure that all of us are untrained readers. I mean, I would not claim to be a trained reader, but I have Assyriological colleagues who read cuneiform texts really quickly. So I have checked with them to see whether the saccades are possible, and they've conceded that there's no such visual clue as to word dividers. But really good Assyriologists, really good Egyptologists are certainly, I don't think they're any less trained than ancient scribes would have been. Not someone like me who sort of dabbles in it, but like someone who really spends their life reading cuneiform texts. It's likely that they've read more cuneiform texts than a Mesopotamian scribe has read. Those people read, a few hundred. Our graduate students, we put them through hell. They read many thousands of texts and then publish whole corpora. So it's I don't think that we should assume that modern readers are inherently worse than ancient readers. We're obviously not native speakers of the language. That's something that we will never become. But as in terms of our scribal training, I'm not sure that we're actually inferior.
Very good point, Aaron. I think we can conclude with this. Very good point. It was lovely. It was wonderful. Of course, we are recording this, so everybody can rewatch if they want to. And we will be posting this on our website in Scribe, Invention of Scripts and Their Beginnings. Thank you, Aaron, so much. It was wonderful. I hope this is coming out as a paper soon. It should do.
I think it needs more work. But thank
Counting
you.
word dividers, definitely.
Yeah. Thank you again, Sylvia.
Thank you. It was wonderful. Thank you, everybody. We will meet you again in 7 days' time with Thorsten Meissner from the University of Cambridge and his new ideas on Cretan hieroglyphic. Thank you so much. See you then. And thank you, Aaron, again. Lovely to see you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everybody. Take care.